Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. This is Fahim Niaz. I'm the product manager for Anime Studio. As everyone knows, Anime Studio is the best tool for creating cartoons and animations. We have two versions of the product, Debut as well as Anime Studio Pro. Today's webinar will be about physics and how to apply physics in Anime Studio Pro. We're very lucky here to have allocated some time from Jason Cozy, who I will introduce a little bit later. He will be discussing physics in the Pro product. If you would like to find out some more information about Anime Studio, you can at anime.smithmicro.com. Before we begin the presentation, I have a few housekeeping items I'd like to discuss. I wanted to welcome everybody, and I wanted to let everyone know that you will all be muted except for the panelists. Today we have three panelists, myself, Jason Cozy, as well as Michi Catanese. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the Q&A window. The more questions you ask, the better interactivity we'll have, so please do start asking questions right away. We will be recording this webinar, and it will be available on our website in approximately a week's time. If there are any technical issues, please pardon us, and hopefully there won't be any. So a little bit about Jason. Jason is the lead QA engineer for Anime Studio. He's been involved with the product since 2006, and he has been managing the Anime Studio beta program for a while as well. He has a background in motion graphics and design, and he's a very avid user of Poser, so he has a good understanding of all of our products that we have on the graphics end at Smith Micro. So with that, I look forward to this webinar. I look forward to learning a few new things myself about physics, and I am going to pass the ball over to Jason now, and he will begin his presentation.
Hello everybody. I want to welcome you to the webinar today, and if you're viewing the recorded version, welcome on the day you're viewing. Today we're going to walk through, as Fahim said, we're going to walk through some of the basics of setting up a physics simulation within Anime Studio Pro. Then we're going to move through some of the parameters, and then we'll get into some details using the physics with a figure that has bones set up. We should have some time left after that to get into some more advanced aspects of physics, and then before we finish up, we'll go through some Q&A, answer some questions that any of you may have posted through the Q&A section. So let's get started. So first off, I'm just going to get started and just show you how easy it is to set up a basic quick physics simulation, and we'll do that with a bouncing ball. So oops. Let me switch. Let me start a new Anime Studio file here. And over here in the layers palette, I'm going to set up some layers. So the first one I'm going to leave alone for now, but I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to create a group. Now, if for some reason you click this button here and these options are grayed out, it'll be because you're on a frame outside of 0. So you really kind of want to work on frame 0. Another thing that I really like to do is name all my layers. I think it's great when you oops, I guess it didn't name properly, but it's great when you go back and you look at a file, you know what's going on, instead of hunting and pecking around trying to figure out what's what. So I'm going to create this is just a layer group right now, but you need a layer group to basically set up physics. So what I'm going to do is drag this vector layer into that group, and you can always tell by closing it and opening it to see what's in there. And let's double click that layer and go in and just name this one ground. There's nothing on it right now. This will be the one that I create the ground on. Then I'm going to go in and create another vector layer here, and we'll call this one ball. So let's switch back to the ground layer, and I'm going to go over here to the tools palette and draw a shape. Now I could use one of the other tools here and draw any shape, but I'm just going to create a rectangle here and do a down and dirty ground layer and change my color here so it's brown. So I'm dragging that just on the bottom edge of the viewport here, and so this area here with the purple is what will be rendered when you output. So I'm just making on the bottom edge there. So now I click on the ball layer and let's make that ball red. So I change my style before I create the ball and hold the shift down to keep it round. And now what I need to do is go to this group layer, double click it, and there's a physics tab here. So I click the physics tab and select enable physics. Now you can change your gravity direction to go, in any direction, and the magnitude on how intense that gravity is. I'm going to leave it at the default here. And if I just hit play now, you notice that everything just falls off the screen. Well, that's because the ground, everything is being affected by that gravity. So I'm going to double click the ground layer, go to the physics tab for that. Now, you only get this physics tab if it's within that group that physics is enabled. So there's a bunch of parameters here that I'm going to eventually go over in the webinar, but first off, we're just going to hit non-moving object. So that makes the ground a non-moving object, and it is still calculated in the physics simulation, it just doesn't go anywhere. So I hit play again, and now the ball bounces and hits the ground. So each time you hit play, it's recalculating those physics and creating keyframes for that. So, some of the ones I'll show later, it gets a little more advanced. They may change a little bit each time, and we'll get into how to stop that from happening. But so that's kind of just the basics. I mean, we can just go and add a new layer in here. In this case, I'm just going to duplicate the ball, and then I'll go over to the layer translation and just offset it and start it down here and hit play. And now it just recalculated that physics simulation with both those balls. So that's basically kind of just a quick, down and dirty way to just get started with physics. So let's see, what do I have next on the agenda here? I think I'm going to jump over to a star example, and I'm going to use this one just kind of how physics works with the bones. So let's create another. I started a new file here, and I'm going to go in here and call this one star, and then we'll create another one again, call it ground. I probably could have used the same file I had last time and just deleted the balls, but I wasn't thinking ahead. So, okay, so now we have nothing again here, so let's create that ground layer again, and this time, oops, instead of the circle, let's choose the rectangle. Go up here to the star layer, and now I'm going to switch the shape to a star, and just for purposes of seeing the points, I'm going to have that a light blue. Well, hopefully you guys can see that. Okay, yeah. So, actually that star is kind of big. Undo that, and let's create it a little bit smaller. Okay. So there we go. So now we have the star, and if let's double. Oops, I got to turn physics on. Click OK. Go back to the ground. Make it a non-moving object. Okay. So now, again, just like the ball, it'll drop, but I'm going to set up some bones on this star here, and we're going to do some fancy stuff. So let's go over here to the layers palette, create a bone group, bring that star within the bone group, Now I'm going to create some bones. So when you have the bone group selected here in the layers, you'll have some new tools that show up over here. I'm going to choose the Add Bone tool. I'm going to create a hip and a head, and then I'm going to create like an upper arm, lower arm example here. And then I'm just going to do one bone on each of the other limbs here. So there is also this the bone strength here, and this is this red circle that goes around it. I'm going to select all here and just click and drag to the left here to reduce that. Now what happens here with physics is if I keep it large and then hit play, oops, I had some animation in my document still, so I'm going to clear the animation from my document, hit play. And now you'll notice here that that region, the star itself didn't actually hit the ground. And when you render, this oval around the bones isn't going to show up. So you want to make that region to the edge of the object or shape. So in this case, I'm going to select all again and select that region and reduce it down. Now there's the bone physics here, and you select that, and it actually is based off the same thing. So they can have different settings, but the bone physics is based off the strength from the bone that you set originally. So I usually set it with the bone strength tool. So now if I hit play again, it's a little more closer, but all my bones are falling apart here, and it's because I don't have constraints set up. So I still have all of them selected, and I go over here to the Select Bone tool, and I get this menu up above, and there's a bunch of options here. The only ones I'm going to touch on today are the angle constraints, and I'm going to set this to, let's say, -20 and 20, and click Close. So now when I'm going to clear my animation again from the document. And now I'm going to hit play, and you'll see it doesn't collapse as much, but I didn't set, let's see, let's go back here. It still collapses a little, and the reason is because my linking's kind of strange here on the bones, and it sets that up according to how you have them linked. So I'm just going to quickly switch back and forth between the linking and the Select Bone tool, and link all of these back into the center. So I'm just using the key commands here, but the tools are over on the left. So now each one of these bones or limbs are kind of linked back into the core, and we should see it not collapse as much here. Still collapses a little, but the angle constraints keep it from collapsing too much. Now, I think I was going to touch on this a little bit later in advance, but I think I'll cover it now since I have this star up. I'm going to just select one of these bones, this one limb here, and I'm going to turn on bone dynamics, and this will actually make it a little bouncy. I do have to make one adjustment here though, because when you're using bones, it's only going to bend based on how many points you have there. So I'm going to add a few points in here so that this limb can bend here. Let's go back and hit play, and now you'll see that wiggle a little bit, and that's from those bone dynamics. So you can get that when you're just, if you rig a figure and just set the bone dynamics on the hand or the tip of the limb and move it with some keyframes, you can also get that same effect. But I kind of wanted to show it here with physics because it's kind of a cool thing to show. Let's see. So another thing I can do with this star, which again is a little more advanced, is the star hits the ground and it just kind of hangs there. I'd like to have it kind of return back to its neutral position. So I'm going to go back to the bone group here. I'm going to select all, and click on the bone physics tool. And I have a few options up here: motor speed, motor torque, return to neutral. I'm going to select return to neutral, and I'm going to use some settings here. I'm going to do a motor speed of 300 and set my torque to 15. So you know, depending on your object, you may have to play with these a little bit to kind of figure out the numerical range that works good for your object. But now if I hit play again here, I still had my physics. So you can either clear the animation from your document like I'm doing, which will clear out all these keyframes, or what happens if you let it play through to the end of the play range and start back over, it will reset those frames. But for ease of use here, I'm just clearing it from the document. So in this case, it fell and it returned to neutral a little faster than I would have liked. Let's go back here and set this to 0.15 and see how that works. Okay, so you notice this one came back to normal. So I can sit and tweak each one of these separately and get each one of the legs and arms to come back and return to the neutral position at different speeds if I wanted. You know, it works for something like this with a star, but if you have a figure that, a rigged character that you're using, you may want to just stop physics and then animate them picking themselves back up or standing back up, because return to neutral might seem a little stiff for a character. So that's kind of some of the basics there on using a rigged figure. I'll get back later into using a character and that is rigged as well. But right now I'm going to jump over to some of the parameters that you can use for physics to get a variety of different effects. So when you double-click that physics layer, you double-click one of the layers within physics. So let's select this. I'm going to hide this star and just create a new layer with a ball.
Hi guys, while Jason is setting this up, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A section. If we don't get to the questions right away, we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Okay, so I've created another just ball and ground simple example here. So if I double click the ball and I go back to the physics tab, we already covered non-moving objects. So this is going to be objects like a ground, maybe a tree, a wall, something like that, where your other objects would collide with it and that object would not move. And they're still calculated in the physics, it's just non-moving. So we covered that. Now there's start asleep. So with start asleep, your object you can set it up so that there's, for say, 24 frames, it sits where it's at, and then after the 24 frames pass, then it's like let go and becomes affected by the gravity. You can also have it, if this is set to 0, you can have it start asleep, and let's move it down here a little bit and just duplicate this layer. So we have ball 2, and on ball 2 we're not going to have that start asleep. Move ball 2 up, and ball 2 down, ball 1 down here. And now what's going to happen here is it might go a little quick, but what's going to happen here is the ball 2 is going to fall, ball 1 hangs there suspended until it's collided with, and then it becomes part of the physics simulation. So that's a way to kind of add a delay to some objects there. Let's go back to the physics settings. Again, each time I'm double-clicking that layer, and it brings up the layer settings, and I'm clicking that tab. So we have start asleep. So let's turn that off and go with an initial direction. Now, let's turn this down to the bottom right and set the speed to 10. So it's going to fly through pretty quick. Now let's move this ball up in this top corner, hit play. So now you see how it flies down in that direction. Still affected by the gravity, it's just got that speed of 10 that makes it fly through compared to the other object. All right, double click that ball again, and so we can leave these alone here for now. So then there's density, friction, and springiness. If any of you were able to watch the YouTube video that was linked to from the website for this presentation, there's some samples in that video that show, like for example, show friction, and I'm not going to bring that up right now. Well, actually, we haven't had any problems with the display of the video being choppy. Let me see if I can bring that up. Let me hit cancel here. I'm just going to bring this up and show you instead of explain it. Save this in case we want to come back to it. Okay. Just navigate here quick, and friction. Okay, in this sample, what I've done is I've set up a folder, and I've named each layer here, and I have a different setting for each one of these boxes that are different colors, and the setting is the friction that that is set to here. So this friction here is 0.1. I believe all of them have the same density and springiness. So what happens here when we play this is you'll see some of them hit and stick, where some of them keep sliding. So the friction, when it's set to 0.1, it's maybe like it's a water slide, a more lubricated surface, where a 4.0 could be almost on the verge of Velcro. It bounced there once and then stuck pretty tight. So there's an example of friction. And let's open up a new file here, and let's try springiness. So now I've done, actually I just imported the movie instead of the file. So now in this example here, I've set each one of these objects here to a different springiness setting. And on the background, or I'm sorry, on the, I called it angle 3, but this is the outer frame, which is that non-moving object to kind of contain the objects here. And then I had a text layer that is outside of the physics that was just a label. So if I double click this box 0.1 here and go to physics, you'll see that I haven't touched any of the other settings here. I've just went in and set springiness to 0.1. Now if I hit play on the physics here, you'll see that each one of these boxes, although all of them are affected equally by the gravity, the 0.9 and the 1 box continue to bounce for quite a while, and actually to the end of my play range here. So you can get different types of objects from a brick to a rubber ball here, just by setting the springiness on those objects. Let's see, what are we going to look at here next? So there was friction and springiness. The density is going to be similar. So I don't have a setup example of density right now, but as you lower the density, it makes a lighter object like a feather or such. I'm going to move on to the next section here, which is pivot on immersion. And I do have another example for this, but I kind of want to, before I get to that, I kind of want to show you just basically setting that up and something to keep in mind when you do. So in this case, I have this ball that had that initial direction. I'm going to shut that one off, and I just have this one ball that is just going to bounce down. So now this crosshair is right here in the middle. This is the origin point for that layer, and this comes into effect in a lot of different ways when you're manipulating objects within Anime Studio, and within physics it does too. So in this case, I'm going to kind of show you why. So right now we have the ball and it's offset from that origin, but I'm going to go and while I'm on the same layer, I'm just going to create another object and say draw it over here, and then hit play. So now you notice both those objects are on the same layer, and it kind of worked kind of cool. But now if I move the origin point over here, hit play, it may not. In some cases, what will happen is your objects will bounce around, and that's kind of a bad example. But I just kind of wanted to show how when you have multiple objects connected there, it's good to kind of keep track of where your origin point is, especially if there's a springiness to those and they end up bouncing off some walls. You can see some weird behavior there. So let's get rid of this triangle. I delete. I'm going up here to my tool, deleting it. So let's come back to the ball, and let's say we want to make this a something like kind of a paddle wheel that pivots around. And I'm going to create just an extension here off to the side. So I'll go back, double-click this layer, go to the Physics tab, and I select Pivot on Origin. And what will happen here if I don't enable the motor is it will stay there until it gets hit, or it'll just fall and swing. But I'm going to enable the motor so it has a motor speed and torque. Just leave the defaults for now, and let's see what that does. Hit play. Well, what's happening here is it's pivoting on the origin point, so it's out here. It's not quite what I wanted to do. So what I'll do here is I'll go over to the Set Origin Point under the Layer Set Tools, and I'm going to click that right in the center of that ball. I'm going to translate this layer down so you can see it, the whole thing. And we'll hit play again. So now it's pivoting around off that origin point, and you have more of what, say, a paddle wheel might work like. You can add more extensions here and draw it out and make it look cool. So there's pivot on origin, and I'll just kind of show you another example here using pivot on origin that I'm going to have an example here. Where's that one? Aha, paddles, yes, if I could see straight. See, I haven't had enough coffee. Okay, in this case, got a lot going on, but I'll kind of explain it a little bit. This dark blue around the edges is just a rough container that I built out of some shapes on a non-moving object layer. And then each one of these paddles is basically what I showed you. It's just, I called it generator here, but it just spins around their origin points. And then I added a whole bunch of balls into the scene. So I hit play here, and you'll see all these balls bouncing around and getting, pushed around by the paddle wheels. And so you can get some different effects here using that. One thing with this scene that you might notice it's a little weird is they come into the corner and they kind of levitate back up. And it kind of seems unnatural there. But what I did is I have another one of the other parameters here that we'll talk about, the force field. And what I did is I set up invisible force fields in those corners. Let me see if I can find those. Actually, I called those generators for some reason. But so yeah, so I just set up a square in this corner and change the transparency of it so that you couldn't see it in the final output. It's kind of an invisible generator that might be from a wind tunnel or some big fan or magnet, something like that. So there's an example of the pivot on origin with some other objects all in the same simulation. Let's see. Now let's go on to force field. So the force field is just the next setting down, and I selected this box here, which I had the force field set to, and I just left it at the default settings. So that's one way to have some sort of repelling magnetism type effect. It doesn't pull an object towards it; it will only repel it. What I did too is on the style for this, you'll see that you can't just create a path and have that be an invisible generator. You actually have to create a style that has a transparency on it. So I actually created this blue and just from the background color or whatever, and in the color picker here I pulled it way down to you know, a transparency that won't render into the final output. So that's kind of one example of that force field. Let's see. I know I have another example here too. I might as well pop that up. Bumper 4. So in this case, it's very similar, except I don't have the pivot on origin. I actually was creating something that was kind of like bumpers in a pinball machine. And I'm just going to play this first, and then we'll take a look at it. So the different color balls bounce down and are bouncing off force fields that are set up around these spheres. And then, you know, these rectangular objects here are also force fields. I just didn't change the fill on it to hide them. I just left them visible. In the case for these bumpers here, when you render it, they come out, render it quick, they come out transparent. So I'll kind of show you what I did here on these. So if I zoom into this one, and let's find that one in my layers here. So that one's bumper 1. So I have 9 different bumper edges here. If I select bumper edge 8 and double click it and look at it, what I've done is I've set the force field angle on this one layer to be off to the top left direction here, and with a force magnitude of 20, which will repel everything a lot faster. And then each one of these other bumpers is pretty much just, I just drew it out quick, but you could potentially copy and paste these around or duplicate layers and shift them. And each one, I've altered that force direction a little bit so that it would repel it in a more natural direction. If they were all on the same layer, you could only have one force direction. So if this whole bumper was just a circle, I would only have the one setting here. So this was a way to kind of repel things in what appears to be the same object in different directions. So let's see.
I actually have a quick question to ask you. Somebody wants to know if you can manually animate the paddle in your paddle example. For example, if you have a character's hand so that the ball can collide with the moving hand. So if your paddle has a rig in it and it can actually move.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you heard the question fully, but somebody was asking if you could adjust the objects to interact with the physics a little bit. And in a way you can, but the physics simulation is based off of, actually just let me look at my notes here. I'm going to touch base on starting and stopping physics here in a little bit. I just want to see if it's okay to jump to that section quick. You know, I actually will jump to that, but so to answer the question quickly, and then I'll kind of get into it a little bit again when I bring up this next file. But the physics calculation is actually based off of that first frame. So if I go in and let's choose one of these. Let me just think about this quick. So if I select this bumper, and let's just ignore that there's those force field edges on there, and I go over here to frame, let's see, before it collides, go to frame 5, and I want to take and select this point and bring it up here so that it collides up there. Let's go back and hit play. It's actually not going to collide up there. As you can see, the ball passes through that edge, and the reason behind that is because at frame 0, when it starts calculating the physics, it needs to know where everything's at, and if everything is moving around, if points are moving around everywhere, it gets very complex. The calculations become so intense. I'm not sure if the machines can handle it. Although, so basically, to answer the question, that is, there's a limitation there regarding that. There's some ways around it, which I'll try to get to, but you can't really move the objects in the middle and have them still interact with the physics. Obviously, the points can move there, and other objects can animate as well as this object, but they're going to be based off that first initial frame on kind of its perimeter there, or its outline. I think that probably needs to feel like that might answer that question.
Yes,
okay.
There's a follow-up question that's very similar. There's a follow-up question that's very similar that I'm going to ask of Jason. So a participant asks what the best way to apply physics is to objects in an animation. So would it be better to set up the character in an Anime Studio document with bones and export it as an object into another document? And she further explains by saying this is in case of multiple characters in animation.
Yeah, I would say, definitely if you're going to have a character that's within physics, I would save it out into the library or into its own file, and use that, in case you're messing around with the physics file and you alter that figure and he or she is supposed to show up in a dozen other scenes in this episode or something, and you've now done something to affect it. I would definitely create kind of a master file for that character, and then bring that in. But one thing I'll show is you can mix the physics in with either more physics layers or with other objects that aren't affected by physics in a whole scene. I feel like I'm blind today. Do you guys see maybe I didn't create I was going to create one where I had a guy falling down the stairs, but we can actually kind of create that on the fly. That shouldn't take too long. We still got a few minutes. I'll show you one more example quick before that, and then we'll get to the guy falling down the stairs and have him in the scene with the background and stuff that isn't affected by animation. This was just something that I quickly created to see if we could put some stuff in a washing machine and have it tumble around in there. So what I've done in this one is this box body layer here is that non-moving object, and I just created that so that it's kind of a container for everything, and it does animate and pivots around the origin, and you can actually see that my center point on the origin there isn't perfect, so it wobbles a little bit, so it might be an older washing machine. But then I've got just some heads that I brought in from some of the figures in the library, and I created a sock, and the sock was very simply kind of along the lines of maybe that star that I showed you a little bit earlier. I just drew out with the freehand tool quickly object. I utilized the line width to increase the width here on the stroke and put some bones in there with some constraints so that the sock, excuse me, when it folded over didn't collapse in on itself. And I'll show you an example of that right now. So that's basically that. That's all within one folder that I didn't name here, but that's the physics folder right here. And then there's a background that isn't part of the physics. So let's just create a new file here and go to the library and select some items from the library. Let's go with, first off, let's find a background here. Let's go with the forest scene. And now let's go in. Oh, that one not look so good.
Just be careful with WebEx.
Yeah. I was loading too quickly.
Problems if you're creating it on the fly, so just be aware.
Yeah. So if you guys are seeing some artifacts here, I'm sorry. There's occasionally with WebEx, if I move too quickly, it can't keep up with me. So I'm going to load the crazy guy under the random characters, and let's scale him down. So I'm going to select the skeleton layer here and go to scale layer and just shrink him down a lot and move him up here. Let's go over here and check out these mountains. So actually what I want to do is have him fall down some mountains. So like he's out on a hiking trip and trips and falls. So there's the forest is a background layer here. There's actually nothing on layer 1 right now. And then I have crazy guy here and his skeleton rig within that. So now what I'm going to do within that crazy guy, because this is what I'm going to set up with physics. So I might as well just turn that on now, and you know, make a note that I added physics there. Oops. Yeah, if I could spell. Okay, so now we're going to create a new vector layer, and let's create kind of a, you know, some sort of random mountain here for him to fall down. So I'm just using the freehand tool and just drawing an object here. And you know, it basically uses whatever style you have selected the first time you draw something, and I can go over here and use select shape to change the style there. So let's kind of match it up a little with that pink mountain in the background. So now I'm going to double click that and make that a non-moving object. Select OK. Now one thing you want to be careful of here is we don't want him to be actually intersecting with this, because sometimes it will think it's within the object and kind of get messed up. So we'll just keep them close there, and then let's check this out and see if I did everything kind of correctly there. So there, he falls down that mountain, and I'll just scrub back in the timeline here just by dragging and clicking and dragging across here. So what happens is he just falls, hits the hill there, and then collapses in on himself. So, you know, going back to the bones before, what happens here is he doesn't have the angle constraints set up on any of his bones. So I can just go select all, go over here, or go over to select bone tools and double click angle constraints, and I don't know, let's use say 40, negative 40 and a 40 here. All right, so I'm gonna, if I leave that layer selected, obviously I can see all the bones and everything. I'm just gonna click off it so it doesn't clutter up the viewport. Hit play here, and now he kind of stays more intact and falls and slides down the mountain. Now, I actually can, so to answer one of the questions before, he's not interacting with the background at all, because this forest background is not within this physics layer. So the only thing within this physics layer is this pink hill here and the guy, so what's showing right now. So I can add other objects into the scene and animate them and you know, have them not interact with the physics. You know, one thing I can do too is, you know, sometimes you may want to stop and start physics. So let's just hit play here, and let's stop right here on the edge of the scene, scrub back a little bit and say, well, right here I want them to just stop. And so I can double click that physics group again, go to the physics tab and unselect enable physics. And when I click OK here, you'll see it show up in the timeline, the enable physics, and it'll show you how long that physics simulation is for. Now in this case, there's still keyframes for this guy after this, so he still does slide. But if I select the skeleton layer here and just bring up my timeline so I can see everything, I can go in, select these keyframes just by dragging, selecting around them, hit delete, and now he basically stopped right there. And that ends the physics, and then I can go in and, you know, animate him and start having him like pick himself up and create whatever animations I'd like to after that. You can go back in later and start physics again, but one thing when you're doing that is the physics direction cannot be changed when you do that. So on that layer, the physics directions and magnitude would have to stay the same. So you could, if you wanted something to happen where it was the camera moved and it was somewhere else, and you wanted a different angle, you would kind of duplicate that layer in the layers groups and maybe run another simulation.
So if it's all right, we're going to answer some questions.
Oh, yeah, no problem.
We have about 10 minutes left in the webinar. And if there's some time, Jason will continue with some of the other examples that he has. Otherwise, we're pretty close to the end of the webinar, and we're getting a few questions here.
Can I point out one thing before the question? So the one last thing that I wanted to point out, so I think I pretty much covered everything I intended to, was use baked physics. And with this, I mentioned earlier, each time you run physics, especially like in one of the examples where I had a bunch of the balls bouncing around, each that you run it a second time, it may not exactly be the same each time. It's going to be pretty close, but it may differ slightly. If you select use baked physics, it in a way locks down those keyframes so that it doesn't recalculate the physics again each time it's played back. So you will get the same results. So it's a handy way to get those results. So what kind of questions you got for me?
Sure. Okay. Two questions are directly related to one another, and they're both in regards to 3D objects in physics. Is there an example that you could demonstrate where you have a 3D object and you apply some physics to it?
So I'm assuming when they say 3D objects, they mean an OBJ, like an actual 3D object.
Right.
You can do something you guys may be familiar with, is you double click a vector layer. There's 3D options, and you can extrude it. Let's just click OK there. If I change the angle of of this object, you can kind of see on the edges there's some depth to it there. Well, you can extrude vector objects so that they appear to be 3D as well. So it will interact the same. It's interacting with that edge of the line here. So there's that. Now OBJs, they're not going to be affected by the physics if you just bring in an OBJ. There's kind of a way to do that. It's similar to doing say an image. So I could show that. You're going to get some weird results because it's going to collapse the object on a single 2D layer instead of a 3D space that the object's in. It's possible, just like it's possible to put a 3D object into a layer with bones. The results are going to be, you know, a little strange sometimes. Not like you would expect with a 3D object that's rigged in 3D space, because this is all happening in 2D space.
So you're recommending that if anybody does 3D and uses physics with 3D, they should use the extrude and the 3D capabilities within that layer.
Yeah, that's a way. So, you know, that's not bringing a 3D object in and having 3D objects collide, but you know, the extrude gives you you know, some 3D aspect to that vector object.
Okay, I do have a couple other questions. The other one is I've noticed that all the items that are reacting to the physics demo gravitate to the right. Is there a reason for that?
It's probably because the angle I had on the gravity, or when I drew the object, it wasn't level, and so the right-hand side of that ground plane was probably lower than the left-hand side and brought it down. You can change the gravity here so that it goes to any direction, so it would gravitate in any direction, you know, even upward. So it was probably an error drawing on my end of things.
Okay, the other question is, if you restart physics, if the hill has moved, does the physics engine use the points using frame 0 or the frame when you do the restart?
It should use it on the frame when you restart.
So I have a couple other questions of my own while we ask other folks to come in with more questions. If you have any more, we still have a few minutes to answer questions. So can you use physics with images?
You can use physics with images. Let me just create a new file and show you. Let's see here. Let me create a new group. I'm just going to start fresh. You need to rig it with bones. So let's see if I can do this quick here. So, oops. Okay, I have a black ground today. So there's a ground layer. We'll go in, turn on the physics here, and make this non-moving object real quick. Now let's go to library and import an image. So we'll just pick the first image that shows up here. So this image is pretty huge, so I'm just going to scale it down here so that we can see it a little bit better. So I'm going to bring this up towards the top of the scene, and now I'm just going to hit play on this physics. And you'll notice nothing happens, and it doesn't know, because an image that you bring in could be a PNG, and it could have an alpha channel and transparency to it and stuff. It doesn't know the bounds of that image. So the best way to go about this is to create a bone group, put that image within the bone group, and then I'll quickly create some bones here on this image and just around the perimeter here. And you'll see that, I might as well just hit play, and you'll see that now it's affected. And because I don't have any constraints on those bones, they fall apart when they hit the ground, thus it warps that image. So what you want to do is select all the bones and set up angle constraints to 0. Hit close, and there. Now it just falls down. So, and it will, you know, just like I showed earlier, it will be on that bounds of those bones. So if I want to tighten that up a little bit, make sure I have all the bones selected, select the bone physics region here, and I can just click and drag within that red capsule area around it and reduce it down. So now when I hit play, it will hit the edge there. So that would be a way to do the images.
Okay, perfect. The other question is, can the direction of gravity be animated?
The direction of gravity cannot be animated. So, as I mentioned a little while ago, when you set it up for a layer, it's set for that layer. So if you come back at frame 72 later and double-click that and change it, it changes it for the whole timeline for that physics folder. So that would be the case if you're stopping and starting physics as well. The second time you start the physics, the gravity direction is going to be the same as the first, and if you change it on the second, it will change it on the first.
Okay. An earlier question came up that said, for bone rigging, is there a manual or a guide that kind of explains some of the settings, such as numerical values that you selected? And I can answer that, and I can just say that in the user manual, under the help menu item, there is a user manual, and there's definitely more information on setting up numerical values within the bone rigging. So feel free to check that out. There's also one last question here. If you guys have any more questions, please feel free to do so and ask away in the Q&A section. So the question goes back to the paddle and the hand example.
Yep.
This participant is saying, couldn't you create an invisible force field object that tracks with, say, a hand, thus providing the effect you're asking about with the collision of the ball and the hand?
Having that, you could, I think, yeah. You could have, you know, as you set up different groups and layers within that physics folder, there's one thing to keep in mind: if you can't go more than a folder deep. So if I created another folder, like 3 folders deep within the physics, it only affects into the first one. So you see some weirdness there. Kind of move some of your objects around and fill them that way. But you can also, I don't know if I mentioned this, you can also have multiple physics simulations in the same file. So I can duplicate this physics simulation and translate this one over. They will not interact with each other. You know, the one passes through the other, but there's 2 separate physics simulations going on that don't interact.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jason. That sort of brings us to the end of the webinar.
Cool. I just wanted to say thanks to everybody for you know, letting me get into all the physics stuff. I hope we see a lot of cool stuff that you guys create with it. It's a fun area of the product for me, so I was happy to show it off.
So thank you, everybody, for joining us today and spending your precious time with us the last hour. And thank you, Jason, for taking the time to demonstrate physics in Anime Studio Pro. Like we previously mentioned, this webinar was recorded, and it still is being recorded, and it will be available in approximately a week's time on our website. You can check out the anime.smithmicro.com website for more information on Anime Studio if you'd like to get some more knowledge about the product. Or for the webinars, you can just look at the link that's there, anime.smithmicro.com/webinars.html, and the webinar will be up then. So thank you very much. We appreciate your time. We'll also be on Facebook, so if you have anything that you'd like to post with regards to you know, Anime Studio, or if you have a cool animation to show, please go up on Facebook and show us your stuff. We'd love to be able to see it and share with others. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.